There are places in this world where the dead do not rest beneath the earth. They do not lie in quiet graves marked by weathered stone, nor do they settle into the patient darkness of sealed tombs. Instead, they hang suspended between heaven and earth, their coffins swaying gently in mountain winds that have blown for 3,000 years, their remains perched on cliff faces so sheer and inaccessible that standing at their base, craning your neck upward, you cannot help but ask the question that has haunted every visitor, every archaeologist, every curious soul who has ever gazed upon them. How did they get there? In the limestone gorges of southern Sichuan province, where the Yangtze River's tributaries have carved deep valleys through ancient rock, hundreds of wooden coffins cling to cliff faces that rise vertically for hundreds of feet. They are wedged into narrow crevices barely wider than the coffins themselves. They rest on wooden stakes driven directly into the stone, stakes that have somehow endured for a millennium, despite the relentless assault of wind, rain, and time. They perch on natural ledges so small and so high that approaching them seems not merely difficult but genuinely impossible. Some hang alone, solitary sentinels watching over valleys where mist rises in the morning and settles again at dusk. Others cluster together in groups of dozens, entire communities of the dead suspended in the air as if floating, as if the cliff face itself had opened its arms and caught them mid-fall. The people who placed them there are gone, erased, annihilated so thoroughly that even their name, the bow, survives only as a historical footnote, a curiosity mentioned in passing by chroniclers who never bothered to record their language, their stories, their songs, or their secrets. What we know of them fits in a few paragraphs. What we will never know fills the silence of those gorges, a silence broken only by the creak of ancient wood and the whisper of winds that carry no answers. This is a journey into mysteries that refuse to be solved, not because the evidence has been lost to time, though much of it has, but because the knowledge itself was destroyed, the carriers of that knowledge exterminated, the thread of transmission severed so completely that what remains are only fragments, artifacts and questions that grow more haunting the longer one contemplates them. In the heart of China, where civilization first flowered along the banks of the Yellow River, where emperors raised monuments that rivaled the pyramids of Egypt, where philosophers wrote texts that would shape the thinking of billions across millennia, there exist enigmas so profound that they challenge our most basic assumptions about what ancient peoples knew, what they could accomplish, and what secrets they carried with them into oblivion. Stay with us as we step into these mysteries, as we walk among hanging coffins and forbidden pyramids, as we gaze upon a woman dead for 2,000 years whose skin remains soft to the touch, as we stand before abandoned monuments of impossible scale and contemplate the footsteps of a sage who rode west into the mountains and was never seen again. Sit back, relax, and let the mist of the Sichuan gorges settle around you. The dead are waiting, suspended between worlds, and they have much to show us, even if they can no longer speak. The cliff rises before you like a wall erected by gods, limestone, grey-white and ancient, striated with the patient work of water, over geological time, its face pocked with small caves and crevices, worn smooth in some places and jagged in others. At its base the valley floor spreads outward, rice paddies and stepped terraces, small villages where smoke rises from cooking fires, the dark ribbon of a river winding through it all. The air is humid, heavy with the scent of vegetation and stone and something else, something older, something that settles into the lungs like a premonition. And then your eyes travel upward, following the cliff face as it climbs toward the sky, and you see them. Coffins. Wooden coffins darkened by age and weather, some still intact and others partially collapsed, their contents spilling toward the valley floor in slow motion measured in centuries. They are everywhere, tucked into horizontal fissures in the rock, balanced on wooden beams that jut outward from the cliff face like accusing fingers, resting on ledges so narrow they seem to defy physics. Some are positioned 100 feet above the valley floor. Others hang at 200 feet, 300 feet, heights that would require modern climbing equipment and expert skill to reach. The bow people had neither. They had no metal tools beyond bronze. They had no pulley systems that anyone has ever identified. They had no cranes, no scaffolding remnants, no carved staircases ascending the cliff faces. They had only the coffins, their dead, and whatever knowledge allowed them to accomplish what still cannot be explained. The tradition stretches back 3,000 years. Carbon dating of the oldest coffins places their construction in the late Shang dynasty, an era when much of China was still divided into warring kingdoms, when bronze was the cutting edge of technology, when the written characters that would eventually become modern Chinese were still being carved into oracle bones for divination. The Bo people practiced this funerary custom continuously for 30 centuries, a span of time so vast that it dwarfs the entirety of Western civilization since the birth of Christ. Generation after generation they carried their dead into the mountains. Generation after generation they somehow placed those dead on cliff faces that seemed designed by nature to be unreachable. And generation after generation they kept the secret of how it was done, passing it down through oral tradition, through apprenticeship, through whatever mechanisms a pre-literate society uses to preserve its most sacred knowledge. Then came the Ming dynasty, and then came annihilation. The year was 1573. The Wanli Emperor had recently ascended the throne, a teenager guided by advisors who sought to consolidate Ming control over the southwestern frontier. The Bo people, who had maintained their independence in the mountainous borderlands between Sichuan and Yunnan for millennia, were seen as an obstacle. They had resisted Chinese expansion for generations. They had their own customs, their own beliefs, their own ways of honouring the dead that had nothing to do with Confucian propriety or Buddhist reincarnation. They were, in the language of imperial administrators, uncivilized and troublesome. The solution was systematic extermination. Ming armies swept through the Bo homeland with fire and sword, villages were burned, families were slaughtered, those who fled into the mountains were hunted down, those who surrendered were executed anyway. Within a single generation, the Bo people ceased to exist as a distinct culture. Their language, unwritten, died on the lips of the last speakers. Their stories, unrecorded, vanished into the silence of the gorges. Their songs were sung no more, and their knowledge, including whatever technique had allowed them to place coffins on vertical cliff faces for 3,000 years, was erased from human memory as thoroughly as if it had never existed. What remains are only the coffins themselves and the questions they raise. The most obvious question, how, has never been satisfactorily answered. Various theories have been proposed over the years, each encountering its own insurmountable problems. Some researchers have suggested that the Bo used ropes and pulleys, lowering coffins from the cliff tops rather than raising them from below. Yet no evidence of anchor points has been found at the cliff summits, no worn grooves in the rock where ropes might have been threaded, no remnants of the elaborate rigging that would have been necessary. Others have proposed that the Bo built temporary scaffolding, erecting wooden frameworks against the cliff faces that were dismantled after the coffins were placed. But the cliff faces show no holes where scaffold supports might have been inserted, and the sheer scale of scaffolding required to reach heights of 300 feet would have left archaeological traces that simply do not exist. Still others have suggested that water levels were once higher, that the coffins were placed when the rivers ran at elevations that are now far below. But geological and hydrological analysis has found no evidence to support this, and in any case, it cannot explain the coffins placed in areas far from any waterway. The most persistent theory involves a method of gradual ascent. The idea that the Bo somehow climbed the cliff faces, placing wooden stakes as they went, creating a kind of ladder staircase that allowed them to reach the placement sites with coffins on their backs or hauled up in stages. This at least has some physical plausibility. Stakes driven into limestone can support significant weight, and skilled climbers have accomplished seemingly impossible ascents throughout human history. But the coffins weigh hundreds of pounds each. The cliff faces are not merely steep, but often genuinely vertical, and in some cases actually overhang, curving outward so that anyone climbing them would be hanging from the rock rather than pressed against it. And the stakes themselves, those that survive, show no wear patterns consistent with regular climbing use. They appear to have been placed once for the purpose of supporting the coffins and never used again. Perhaps the most unsettling possibility is that the Bo possess some technique so fundamentally different from anything we can imagine that our theories cannot even approach it. We assume that they face the same physical constraints we would face: gravity, weight, the limitations of human muscle and rope and wood. But what if their approach was based on principles we have never considered? What if the solution to the mystery is not merely unknown but genuinely unknowable, because the framework of knowledge required to understand it was destroyed along with the people who possessed it? This is not an idle speculation. Throughout human history, civilizations have developed technologies that seemed impossible to recreate once lost. Roman concrete, which has endured for 2,000 years in seawater, while modern concrete degrades within decades, remained a mystery until very recently. Greek fire, a naval weapon that burned on water and could not be extinguished, was used by the Byzantine Empire for centuries and then vanished so completely that its composition is still debated today. Damascus steel, with its distinctive watered pattern and legendary sharpness, was produced for over a millennium and then became impossible to manufacture when the specific ore deposits ran out. The techniques for combining them with other materials lost to history. Knowledge, it seems, is more fragile than stone, more vulnerable to time than any physical artifact. The bow people may have possessed understanding that we can no longer access not because it was primitive, but because it was sophisticated in ways that left no record, ways that existed only in human minds and perished when those minds were put to the sword. When you stand in those gorges today, and visitors do come, though not in great numbers, drawn by the same questions that draw you now, the silence is absolute. The villages below go about their business, farmers tending fields that have been cultivated for generations since the bow disappeared. The river continues its patient work of carving the valley deeper, millimetre by millimetre, in timescales that reduce human civilizations to passing shadows. And the coffins hang above, watching everything and nothing, their occupants wrapped in silk that has rotted to fragments, their bones slowly shifting as the wood that contains them degrades in the mountain air. Some of the coffins have already fallen. After a millennium, even stakes driven into solid stone will eventually rot through, and when they give way, the coffins plummet to the valley floor. Archaeologists have examined these fallen coffins with the urgency of investigators at a crime scene, knowing that each one contains irreplaceable evidence of a vanished world. What they have found only deepens the mystery. The corpses, despite exposure to open air for hundreds or thousands of years, are often remarkably well preserved, mummified by the dry mountain winds, their skin darkened but intact, their features still recognizable as human faces. They are dressed in silk robes of surprising quality, fabrics woven with techniques that speak to a level of craft far beyond what one might expect from a supposedly primitive minority people. They are accompanied by bronze weapons, tools, and ornaments, some showing influences from Chinese mainstream culture, and others utterly distinct, uniquely bow, their purposes unclear. And they are accompanied by objects that cannot be identified at all, items whose function, whose meaning, whose very nature remains opaque because there is no one left to explain them. The coffins themselves are carved from single logs, hollowed out with immense labour, shaped to fit human bodies in a fetal position, the dead curled as if for sleep, or perhaps for rebirth, returned to the posture of infants awaiting birth. The lids are fastened with wooden pegs that have somehow held for centuries despite the strains of mountain weather. The outsides of some coffins are painted with geometric patterns in red and black pigments, designs that seem to carry meaning but whose meaning was never recorded. Were they clan symbols? Prayers to deities whose names we will never know? Maps to an afterlife that the bow believed awaited their dead? The coffins do not say. They hang, and they wait, and they refuse to yield their secrets to anyone who asks. Perhaps the cruelest irony is that the bow achieved precisely what they intended. They placed their dead high on the cliffs to protect them from animals and tomb robbers, to carry their souls closer to heaven, to ensure that they would remain undisturbed for eternity. And so they have been. For 3,000 years, while dynasties rose and fell in the valleys below, while wars swept through China and regimes succeeded regimes, while the modern world came into being with its machines and its highways and its insatiable hunger for resources, the bow dead have rested in their impossible perches, untouched, inviolate, their eternal peace purchased at the cost of their people's annihilation. They found the immortality they sought, but the price was the death of everyone who could remember their names. The last of the bow vanished in the 16th century, but their coffins will endure for centuries more, slowly deteriorating, slowly falling, slowly surrendering their contents to gravity and time. Each one that falls is a loss beyond calculation, a fragment of a shattered world that can never be made whole. And each one that remains is a question posed to the living, a challenge issued across millennia by people who knew something we do not, who accomplished something we cannot explain, and who took their secrets with them into silence. From the suspended dead of the Sichuan cliffs, our journey turns northward, toward the heartland of Chinese civilization, toward the dusty plains that have been the center of imperial power for over 2,000 years. And there, hidden in plain sight, obscured by trees and politics and the deliberate suppression of information, stands another mystery, one that may prove even more troubling than the hanging coffins, because this mystery is not ancient. It is ongoing. It is actively being concealed. And the reasons for that concealment remain as opaque as the tombs themselves. The year was 1945. World War II was grinding toward its end, the Allied forces pushing back against Japanese occupation across the Pacific Theatre. An American pilot named James Gaussman was flying a transport mission over central China, ferrying supplies to support the war effort. The route took him over the plains surrounding the ancient city of Qian, once the capital of over a dozen dynasties, the eastern terminus of the Silk Road, a city whose history stretched back further than Rome's. Gaussman was not thinking about history. He was thinking about fuel and navigation, and the 1,000 small concerns that occupied every pilot in those dangerous skies. And then he looked down, and what he saw made him reach for his camera. Spread across the plains below, arranged in patterns that were clearly deliberate, were pyramids. Not one or two, but dozens, perhaps over 100. They were enormous, some of them rivaling the Great Pyramids of Egypt in scale. They were perfectly oriented to the cardinal directions, their flat tops and four-sided forms unmistakable even from altitude. They were nothing like anything Gaussman had expected to see in China, nothing like the pagodas and temples that filled his mental picture of Asian architecture. And yet there they were, ancient and massive and utterly real, their shadows stretching across farmland that had been cultivated in their presence for centuries without anyone telling the outside world they existed. Gaussman photographed what he could, limited by the constraints of his mission and his aircraft. When he returned to base, he reported what he had seen, and then something strange happened, or rather, nothing happened at all. The photographs were filed, the reports were noted, and the world went on as if the pyramids of Xi'an did not exist. For decades, the Chinese government denied that the photographs were real. Officials suggested they had been misidentified, that what Gaussman had seen were natural hills, or perhaps ancient tumuli of no particular significance. Western researchers who asked about the structures were told they were mistaken, or simply ignored. The pyramids appeared on no tourist maps, no archaeological surveys, no official documentation of any kind. They were, for all practical purposes, invisible, hidden not by camouflage or concealment, but by the simple expedient of refusing to acknowledge their existence. The truth, when it finally emerged, was stranger than the denial. The pyramids were real. They had been there for over 2,000 years, and the Chinese government knew exactly what they were, had always known, and had chosen to keep them from the world for reasons that remain incompletely explained to this day. They are tombs, imperial tombs to be precise, the final resting places of emperors from the Han dynasty, the Tang dynasty, and other ruling houses that governed China during its classical age. The largest of them, the tomb of Emperor Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor of unified China, the man who built the Great Wall and the Terracotta Army, is not merely a pyramid but an entire complex, a subterranean palace that has never been opened, and whose contents have been the subject of speculation for over 2 millennia. The so-called White Pyramid, visible in Gaussman's original photographs, may be over 250 feet tall, exceeding even the Great Pyramid of Giza if certain measurements are to be believed. The cluster of pyramids near Xi'an represents one of the most significant concentrations of ancient monumental architecture anywhere on Earth, a rival to Egypt's Valley of the Kings, a testament to the power and ambition of rulers who commanded resources on a scale that still staggers the imagination, and yet they remain closed, forbidden, untouched by archaeological excavation, despite the tools and techniques available to modern science. The official explanation is that current technology is not sophisticated enough to preserve what lies inside. This is not entirely implausible. The tomb of Qin Shi Huang, according to ancient historians, contains a model of the emperor's realm complete with rivers of liquid mercury flowing in patterns that mimic the actual rivers of China. Soil samples from around the burial mound have indeed shown elevated mercury concentrations, lending credence to accounts that were once dismissed as exaggeration. If the tomb truly contains vast quantities of mercury, opening it could pose catastrophic risks both to the artifacts within and to the people conducting the excavation. Modern preservation science, for all its advances, might genuinely be inadequate to the challenge. But this explanation satisfies no one who has looked closely at the situation. Ground-penetrating radar surveys have revealed anomalies beneath multiple pyramids, vast chambers, possible passageways, spaces whose purpose cannot be determined without direct investigation. Satellite imagery shows the precise orientations and configurations of the structures in unprecedented detail. Some of the pyramids have been planted with fast-growing conifers, trees that obscure their forms from aerial photography and ground-level observation alike, an active effort to hide what is already officially acknowledged to exist. The disconnect between the stated reasons for keeping the pyramids closed and the apparent behaviour of those who control access to them suggests something more is at play than mere caution. What is inside them? What could be so significant, so dangerous, so valuable, that a government powerful enough to reshape the three gorges of the Yangtze River refuses to permit even the most careful archaeological survey? The treasures alone should be beyond imagination. Emperors of the Han and Tang dynasties ruled one of the wealthiest civilizations in human history, and their tombs would have been filled with gold, jade, silk, bronze, and artistic masterpieces that would rewrite the history of Chinese art. But treasures can be inventoried, preserved, displayed. They do not require secrecy on this scale. Something else lies beneath those flat-topped mounds, something that someone in a position of authority has decided the world is not ready to see. Speculation, inevitably, fills the vacuum left by official silence. Some researchers have suggested that the tombs contain historical documents, records, accounts, genealogies that might complicate or contradict the official narratives of Chinese history as currently taught. Imperial succession was often contested, legitimacy often questionable, and the emperors who ultimately triumphed had strong incentives to destroy or suppress evidence that might undermine their claims. If such evidence survived in sealed tombs, its emergence could be politically awkward even today, when the ruling Communist Party has tied its legitimacy in part to a particular reading of Chinese historical continuity. Others have suggested that the tombs contain technologies or knowledge that would challenge accepted chronologies of scientific development, ancient instruments, texts, artifacts demonstrating capabilities we do not credit to their eras. Still others venture into wilder territory, proposing connections to non-Chinese civilizations, evidence of contact or conflict that does not fit standard historical frameworks. None of these theories can be verified, none can be disproved. The pyramids stand in their rows and clusters, their earthen surfaces weathered by 2 millennia of rain and wind, their contents as inaccessible now as they were when the last emperor was sealed within. Visitors can approach some of them, can walk around their bases, can climb the stepped terraces that erosion and agriculture have carved into their sides, but they cannot enter. The doors have been closed for 2,000 years, and no one knows when, if ever, they will open. What strikes the visitor most forcefully standing in the shadow of these structures is not their size, though they are enormous, but their sheer normality in the landscape. Farmers tend fields that lap against their bases, roads run between them, villages cluster nearby, their inhabitants living their lives within sight of monuments that would draw millions of tourists a year in any other country. The pyramids have been absorbed into the rhythm of daily existence, become simply features of the terrain, no more remarkable to those who see them every day than hills or rivers. This is perhaps the strangest concealment of all, not the denial of their existence, which eventually failed, but the normalization of their mystery, the transformation of the inexplicable into the merely ordinary through sheer familiarity. But they are not ordinary. They are among the largest deliberate structures ever erected by human beings. They were built by civilizations that commanded millions of workers and resources drawn from across a continent. They must contain, wonders that we cannot begin to imagine, and they have been waiting, patient and silent, for someone to finally open them and show the world what lies within. That day has not yet come. The pyramids keep their secrets, and the authorities who control access keep theirs, and the mystery deepens with each year that passes without resolution. From the forbidden tombs of emperors, our journey turns to a single tomb, a single occupant, a woman who died over 2,000 years ago, and whose body, when discovered by accident in 1971, would become the most perfectly preserved ancient corpse ever found. Her name was Xin Jui, History remembers her as Lady Di, the Marquise of Di, wife of a minor aristocrat in the Han Dynasty court. In life, she was a woman of wealth and status, accustomed to luxury, surrounded by servants, indulged in her appetites. In death, she has become something far stranger. A medical specimen, a scientific mystery, a bridge between the distant past and the forensic present that continues to astonish everyone who encounters her. The discovery was pure chance. Workers in the city of Changsha, in Hunan province, were digging an air raid shelter. This was 1971, and tensions with the Soviet Union had prompted a nationwide program of civil defense construction. They were excavating near a hill called Mawangdui, a site known locally to contain ancient burials but never systematically explored. Their shovels struck something unexpected, a layer of white clay, pure and thick, sealing what lay beneath as effectively as any modern containment system. When they broke through, they found themselves staring into darkness, the darkness of a tomb that had not been opened in 1,200 years. The excavation that followed would take years and involve hundreds of researchers. The tomb complex contained 3 separate burials: Lady Di, her husband the Marquis, and a man believed to be their son. But it was Lady Di's tomb, the innermost chamber, that would capture the world's attention. Her coffin was nested within 3 other coffins, each more elaborately decorated than the last, the outermost painted with swirling patterns of clouds and mythical creatures, the innermost covered in silk embroidered with scenes of the afterlife she'd been prepared to enter. The coffins were surrounded by over 1,000 objects: lacquerware, silk garments, musical instruments, food offerings, bamboo manuscripts, figures of servants intended to attend her in death. The wealth represented was staggering, and yet it was nothing compared to what the innermost coffin contained. When the archaeologists opened the final lid, they saw her face. She was looking at them across 2 millennia, and she looked almost alive. The shock of that moment has never entirely faded from the accounts of those who were present. They had expected a skeleton, perhaps some fragments of preserved tissue, the dried remnants of what had once been human. What they found instead was a body so complete, so uncannily present, that several of the workers stepped back involuntarily, as though they had intruded upon someone sleeping. Her skin retained its texture. Her hair remained attached to her scalp. Her eyelashes, still clung to her closed lids, delicate and dark, as though she might open her eyes at any moment and ask what all these strangers were doing in her tomb. The body was submerged in a brownish-red liquid, slightly more than 20 litres of it, filling the space between her and the coffin walls. The liquid smelled faintly of something organic, something that had once been alive. When scientists later analysed it, they found it to be mildly acidic, with traces of magnesium and other minerals suspended within it. The exact composition remains unknown. Despite more than 50 years of study, despite the most sophisticated chemical analysis available to modern science, no laboratory has ever successfully replicated the formula. The fluid that preserved Lady Di, that kept her tissues soft and pliable, while empires rose and fell above her head, was a recipe that died with the people who created it. But the fluid alone could not account for her condition. The tomb itself had been constructed as a sealed system of remarkable sophistication. The layers of white clay that the workers had struck formed an impermeable barrier, blocking moisture and oxygen from the chamber below. Inside this seal, the coffins were wrapped in silk and matting, creating additional barriers. The air inside the innermost coffin had been tested when the tomb was first opened and found to contain almost no oxygen, replaced instead by gases that had leaked slowly from the decomposing body over centuries, creating an atmosphere in which bacteria could not survive. It was a combination of factors working together: the clay, the wrapping, the liquid, the airtight seal, perhaps other elements that have never been identified. The Han Dynasty embalmers had achieved something that modern mortuary science, with all its resources, cannot reliably reproduce. And then the air reached her. Within hours of the tomb's opening, Lady Di's body began to change. The skin that had remained supple for 2,000 years started to darken and stiffen. The tissues that had retained their elasticity began to lose it. The microorganisms that had been held in suspension by the anaerobic environment awakened and began their patient work. The scientists watching this transformation unfold understood that they were witnessing something irreversible. the collapse of a preservation system that had functioned perfectly for 21 centuries and that could not be restored once breached. They worked frantically to transfer her to a sealed environment, to stabilize what remained, to halt the decay that had finally, after all that time, been permitted to begin. They succeeded partially. Lady Di today rests in a climate-controlled display case in the Hunan Provincial Museum, her body still recognizable, still startlingly present, though diminished from the miraculous state in which she was first found. Visitors file past her in a steady stream, peering through the glass at a woman who was already ancient when the Roman Empire fell, already dust in most people's understanding of how bodies behave, and yet still here, still occupying space, still possessing a face that once smiled, frowned, wept, laughed. The cognitive dissonance of the encounter is profound. This is not a reconstruction, not a wax figure, not an artist's interpretation. This is her. This is the woman herself, the actual tissues that move through the world during the reign of Emperor Wen, that ate meals and bore children and attended banquets and fell ill and recovered and fell ill again, and finally, one day in approximately 163 BCE, did not recover. The autopsy performed on Lady Di, and it was a full autopsy, as thorough as any conducted on a modern patient, revealed details of her life that no historical document could have provided. She was approximately 50 years old at the time of her death, short by modern standards but average for her era. She suffered from a number of chronic conditions, coronary artery disease so severe that her arteries were heavily calcified, gallstones, a fused spinal disc. She had borne children. She was overweight. She ate well, perhaps too well. The evidence suggests a diet rich in fats and sugars, the cuisine of the aristocracy. Her blood type was A. Her last meal, still partially undigested in her stomach when she died, had included muskmelon. 138 seeds were found, suggesting she had eaten a substantial quantity of the fruit shortly before her death. The cause of death, the pathologist concluded, was almost certainly a heart attack, brought on by the severe cardiovascular disease that had been slowly killing her for years. This level of medical intimacy with a person dead for over 2 millennia is unprecedented. We know more about Lady Di's health than we know about many medieval kings, more than we know about most of our own ancestors beyond a few generations. We know what parasites lived in her intestines, whipworm and pinworm, both common in the ancient world. We know that she suffered from lower back pain. We know that her lungs showed signs of tuberculosis. We know that her blood vessels were fragile and prone to bleeding. We know, in short, the precise mechanics by which her body failed her, the specific weaknesses that time and indulgence had carved into her flesh. And yet we do not know how she was preserved. We do not know who made the decisions about her burial, what knowledge they drew upon, what traditions they were following. The body tells us everything about the woman. It tells us almost nothing about the people who kept her intact across the ages. This asymmetry haunts the discovery. Lady Di speaks to us with painful clarity about one life, one set of ailments, one final meal. But the technique that made her testimony possible remains opaque. Whoever prepared her body knew something that we do not know. They understood processes, relationships between substances, methods of sealing and preserving that have not survived in any written record. The Han Dynasty was a literate civilization, a bureaucratic empire that kept meticulous records of taxes, censuses, laws, appointments. It should have documented something as remarkable as the embalming method that preserved Lady Di, and yet nothing survives. Either the knowledge was never written down, kept as a trade secret by specialists who transmitted it orally, generation to generation, until the chain broke, or it was written down and lost, consumed by fire or flood, or the simple entropy that devours most of what humans create. 1,000 artifacts surrounded her in death. Silk robes of extraordinary refinement, dyed in colours that have barely faded. Lacquerware dishes still bearing traces of the food placed in them as offerings. Musical instruments, a zither, a set of pipes, arranged as though she might rise and play them. Bamboo slips inscribed with texts on medicine, divination, philosophy. Painted banners depicting her journey to the afterlife, the soul ascending through layers of heaven, guided by dragons and attended by spirits. The tomb was a capsule of Han Dynasty civilization, a snapshot of what mattered to the wealthy dead at the height of China's first great imperial age. Scholars have spent decades studying these objects, reconstructing the beliefs and practices they represent. But Lady Di herself remains the central mystery, the proof that something extraordinary was possible, and the silence about how it was achieved. Her tomb was not unique. Her husband, buried nearby, was also preserved, though less perfectly. Their son, believed to have died young, was in worse condition still. The Mawangdui tombs were part of a broader tradition of elite burial in the Han period, a tradition that valued the physical integrity of the corpse and invested enormous resources in maintaining it. Other noble families, other regions, other centuries, all attempted similar feats. Most failed. The bodies became skeletons, dust, nothing. Lady Di succeeded. Her preservers achieved what thousands of others attempted and could not accomplish. The question of why, whether they stumbled upon a fortunate combination of factors, or whether they possessed knowledge that was rare even in their own time, cannot be answered from the evidence we have. Some have speculated about mercury, that strange liquid metal that appears again and again in Chinese burial contexts, that was believed to confer immortality and was used liberally in the tomb of the first emperor. But no significant mercury was found in Lady Di's coffin. Others have pointed to the specific properties of the white clay, its impermeability, its chemical neutrality. But white clay alone cannot explain the condition of the tissues. Still others have focused on the mysterious red liquid, suggesting that it contained preservative compounds, perhaps herbal extracts, perhaps mineral solutions, that actively halted decay at the cellular level. This seems plausible, and yet no one has been able to prove it. The liquid was analysed, its components catalogued, and still the secret eluded the researchers. They knew what was in it. They did not know how to make it work. Perhaps this is the most troubling aspect of Lady Di's preservation. It suggests that the ancients possessed capabilities we cannot reverse engineer even with modern equipment. We can sequence DNA, we can date organic material to within decades using radiocarbon analysis. We can image the interior of sealed tombs without opening them, and yet we cannot do what a group of Han Dynasty morticians did 21 centuries ago with whatever tools and knowledge they had at their disposal. The gap between their achievement and our understanding is not a gap of technology. We have more technology than they could have dreamed of, but a gap of knowledge, of specific practical wisdom about how certain materials interact under certain conditions. They knew something we do not know. They knew it well enough to apply it successfully, and then they stopped knowing it, or stopped existing, or stopped passing it on, and now it is gone. Lady Di remains, the proof of what was possible, and the rebuke to those who assume that progress moves only in one direction. She watches visitors pass her case with eyes that have been closed for over 2,000 years, and she offers no explanations. The melon seeds in her stomach speak of a hot summer day, a moment of indulgence, perhaps a celebration, or simply an ordinary afternoon made extraordinary only by what came after. The plaque of fat clogging her arteries speaks of decades of rich living, of a body gradually failing even as it was pampered. The delicate eyelashes speak of the care with which she was prepared for eternity, the attention to detail that extended even to the smallest features of her face. Everything speaks, and nothing answers the essential question. Leaving the preserved mystery of Lady Di, our path turns now to something far more monumental in scale, a project of such staggering ambition that it defeats comprehension, and of such profound failure that it has become a monument not to glory but to the limits of human endeavour. In a forested valley outside the ancient city of Nanjing, 3 colossal shapes lie partially buried in the earth, still attached to the mountainside from which they were carved, abandoned in mid-creation, and slowly being reclaimed by the vegetation that has grown up around them over 6 centuries. They are the components of what would have been the largest stone monument ever constructed by human hands, a stele so enormous that merely contemplating its intended transportation defies belief. They are known today as the Yangshan Quarry Stones, and they are among the strangest artifacts on Earth. The year was 1405. The Yongle Emperor, 3rd ruler of the Ming dynasty, had consolidated his power after a bloody civil war against his nephew, the rightful heir to the throne. His legitimacy was fragile, his grip on power secured through violence rather than inheritance, and he sought to shore up his position through acts of monumental construction. The Forbidden City, the Temple of Heaven, the great naval expeditions of Admiral Zheng He, All were products of the Yongle Emperor's reign, all expressions of his determination to demonstrate that his dynasty was favoured by heaven despite the irregularity of his succession. But perhaps his most personal project was the memorial he planned for his father, the founding emperor Zhu Yuanzhang, who had risen from peasant origins to establish the Ming dynasty, and whose tomb complex, the Ming Xiaoling Mausoleum, already stood outside Nanjing. The Yongle Emperor decided that his father's memorial was insufficient. It needed something more, something that would dwarf all previous monuments, something that would announce to the world and to history that the Ming dynasty was the greatest power on earth. He ordered the construction of a stele, a commemorative stone tablet, of unprecedented size. The stele would consist of 3 pieces: a rectangular base, a tall body inscribed with text praising the founding emperor's virtues, and a decorative head in the shape of intertwined dragons. Together, they would form a monument taller than any standing structure in the empire, visible from miles away, a permanent declaration of filial piety and imperial grandeur. The quarry chosen for the project was Yangshan, located in the hills east of Nanjing, where high-quality limestone could be found in massive formations. Engineers surveyed the site. Workers were mobilized, tens of thousands of them, according to some accounts, drawn from across the empire through the corvée labor system that was the foundation of all large-scale construction in imperial China. And then the carving began. What the workers achieved is almost impossible to comprehend without standing in the presence of the stones themselves. The base was carved first, a rectangular block measuring roughly 30 meters long, 13 meters wide and 16 meters tall. When completed, it would have weighed approximately 16,250 metric tons. The body came next, similarly massive, intended to reach over 70 meters in height when stood upright, weighing an estimated 8,800 tons. The head, smaller but still enormous, added another 6,000 tons. The total weight of the completed stele would have exceeded 31,000 tons, more than the weight of a modern aircraft carrier, more than any single object ever moved by pre-industrial humans, more than seemed possible by any means that the Ming dynasty could have possessed. And that apparently was the problem. The stones were never moved. They remain today exactly where they were carved, still attached at their bases to the living rock of the mountain, separated by narrow channels where workers cut away the surrounding stone. The channels are barely wide enough for a person to walk through. Looking up, the walls rise on either side, sheer and smooth, climbing toward a sky that is now partially obscured by the trees that have grown in the centuries since work ceased. The scale is disorienting. The human figure becomes absurdly small, a detail, an afterthought, standing in the shadow of blocks that could not be moved by any number of human figures working together. No surviving document from the Ming period explains why the project was abandoned. This absence of explanation is itself remarkable. The Ming bureaucracy documented nearly everything: taxes, appointments, construction projects, military campaigns. Records survive of far more minor undertakings, far more routine decisions. Yet the abandonment of what would have been the most impressive monument in Chinese history left no trace in the official accounts. The silence speaks perhaps of embarrassment, of a mistake so profound that no one wanted to acknowledge it had been made, of an emperor's ambition colliding with the laws of physics and losing. The leading theory among historians is simple and devastating. The engineers eventually realized, after years of work and untold expenditure of labor and resources, that there was no way to move the stones. The distance from the quarry to the tomb complex was approximately 15 kilometers, through hilly terrain crossed by rivers and soft ground. Even if the stones could be levered out of the quarry, itself a nearly impossible task given their weight, how would they be transported? Rollers would have been crushed. Sledges would have required roads capable of bearing impossible loads. Rivers would have needed to be diverted, bridges constructed that could support weights no bridge had ever supported. The mathematics of the problem had no solution, and at some point someone must have finally had the courage, or the recklessness, to tell the emperor. Perhaps it was a committee that delivered the news, spreading the blame across multiple officials to minimize individual punishment. Perhaps it was a single engineer who accepted his fate and spoke the truth. Perhaps the emperor himself eventually visited the quarry, saw the scale of what he had ordered, and understood without being told. We do not know. The decision was made, the workers were released, the tools were gathered, and everyone walked away. The three stones, base, body, head, remained where they lay, testimony to the gap between imperial ambition and physical reality. 600 years have passed. The forest has closed in around the quarry. Trees grow from crevices in the stone, their roots slowly widening cracks that will eventually, across geological time, break the blocks apart entirely. Moss covers the surfaces that workers once polished smooth. The channels between the stones fill with fallen leaves each autumn, a carpet of red and gold covering the floor of what was meant to be a monument, and became instead a ruin before it was ever completed. Visitors who come to Yangshan today walk through paths that have been cut through the undergrowth, past signs that explain the history in multiple languages. They stand at the base of the stones and tilt their heads back, trying to take in the full height, and they fail. The mind cannot process objects of this scale in a single glance. They were not meant to exist. They exceed the boundaries of what human engineering could accomplish at the time they were carved. They are miracles of labour and failures of logistics, proof that ambition and capability are not the same thing. Some questions linger around the project that are more troubling than the simple narrative of miscalculation suggests. Why did no one raise the transportation problem before work began? The weight of the stones could have been estimated from the planned dimensions. The distance to the tomb complex was known. The terrain had been mapped. It seems inconceivable that the court engineers did not understand what they were committing to undertake. Were they afraid to speak? Did they hope that some solution would present itself as work progressed? Did they assume that the Son of Heaven, having commanded the monument, would also command the laws of nature to accommodate it? Or did they know from the beginning that the project was impossible and proceed anyway, preferring years of employment to the moment when they would have to admit defeat? There is another possibility that historians have been reluctant to articulate fully. Perhaps the monument was never meant to be completed. Perhaps the carving itself was the point. A demonstration of labour, a display of devotion, a statement that the Yongle Emperor could command the mountain itself to yield up stones of impossible weight, even if those stones would never leave the quarry floor. In the logic of imperial power, the demonstration of capability can matter more than the achievement of the goal. The workers who carved those stones were not building a monument. They were performing obedience on a scale visible from heaven itself. The Yangshan Quarry Stele stands today as a monument after all, not to the founding emperor of the Ming dynasty, but to the nature of ambition and its limits. It reminds us that even the most powerful rulers in human history could not command physics to bend, that the gap between imagination and execution is sometimes infinite, that the grandest human projects are sometimes the ones that fail most spectacularly, and perhaps that is a more honest memorial than anything the Yongle Emperor could have erected in his father's name. The stones remain, the forest grows, the questions persist. But China has always been a land where questions outlive the questioners, where mysteries accumulate like sediment, layer upon layer, until the very landscape becomes a palimpsest of unanswered riddles. And nowhere is this more apparent than in the story of a man who chose to vanish rather than remain, who rode west into the mountains and left behind nothing but a slim book and an endless silence. The Hanger Pass in the 6th century BCE was a threshold between worlds. To the east lay the kingdoms of China, the courts, the rituals, the endless cycle of politics and warfare that had consumed the Zhou dynasty for centuries. To the west lay wilderness, mountains without names, rivers without bridges, peoples without writing who would leave no record of their passage through time. The pass itself was narrow, carved through a gap in the mountains, guarded by soldiers who checked the credentials of everyone who passed. In an age before passports, before photography, before the technologies of identification that modern states take for granted, the gatekeeper knew faces. He studied everyone who approached, matching features to names, occupations, reasons for travel. When Lao Tzu arrived at the pass, he must have looked like any other elderly traveller. The accounts describe him as mounted on a water buffalo, which was a humble choice of transportation for a man who had served as keeper of the imperial archives. He could have afforded a horse. He could have travelled in a carriage. But he had chosen an animal associated with farmers, with labour, with the slow rhythms of the earth rather than the swift movements of armies and merchants. Perhaps this was already a statement. Perhaps he was saying without words that he had finished with the world of ambition and speed and wanted only the patient plodding that would carry him into the silence of the West. The gatekeeper's name was Yingxi, and according to the tradition, He was more than a simple guard. He had studied the movements of the stars, he had practiced breath cultivation and meditation. He recognized, as Lao Tzu approached, that this was no ordinary traveller but a sage whose wisdom exceeded that of anyone else alive, and he made a decision that would echo through millennia. He blocked the way. He refused to let Lao Tzu pass. What must that conversation have been like? The old man, weary of civilization, wanting only to disappear into the mountains. The gatekeeper standing firm, insisting that such wisdom could not be allowed to simply vanish from the world. Did Lao Tzu resist? Did he argue that his knowledge could not be captured in words, that the deepest truths could only be lived and never written? Did Yingxi threaten to hold him there indefinitely, or appeal to his sense of duty, or simply refuse to move until the sage agreed? The accounts tell us only the outcome. Lao Tzu sat down beside the gate. He stayed there for several days, and he wrote. The Tao Te Ching, the classic of the way and its power, runs to approximately 5,000 characters in classical Chinese. It can be read aloud in under an hour. It can be studied for a lifetime without exhausting its meanings. The text is cryptic, paradoxical, poetic. It speaks of a way that cannot be spoken, a truth that cannot be named, a power that comes from yielding rather than forcing. It counsels rulers to govern without governing, warriors to fight without fighting, sages to know without knowing. It contradicts itself deliberately and constantly, circling around truths that can only be approached sideways, never directly grasped. The opening lines are among the most famous in world literature. The way that can be told is not the eternal way. The name that can be named is not the eternal name. From the very first sentence, the text undermines itself, warning the reader that anything it says will be a distortion, an approximation, a finger pointing at the moon rather than the moon itself. And yet it continues for 81 brief chapters, offering images, metaphors, koans, glimpses of something vast and ineffable moving beneath the surface of reality. When the writing was done, Lao Tzu mounted his water buffalo and passed through the gate. He rode west into the mountains, and then nothing. No record of where he went, no account of where he stopped, no grave, no memorial, no further teachings. He simply disappeared from human history as completely as if the mountains had swallowed him whole. The silence that followed his departure has lasted 25 centuries. Countless seekers have tried to fill it. Legends proliferated almost immediately. Some said that Lao Tzu travelled to India and became the Buddha, or taught the Buddha, or somehow merged with the Buddha into a single cosmic figure. Others said he achieved immortality through alchemical practices and still wanders the mountains today, visible only to those whose spiritual sight has been properly cultivated. Still others said he died alone in the wilderness, his body consumed by animals or returned to the elements he had spent his life contemplating. None of these stories can be verified. None of them can be entirely dismissed. They exist in the uncertain space between history and mythology, where the absence of evidence allows any narrative to take root. But the mystery deepens the more closely one examines the historical record. The accounts we have of Lao Tzu's life come primarily from Sima Qian, the grand historian of the Han Dynasty, who wrote several centuries after the events he described. Sima Qian was meticulous by the standards of his age, but he was also honest about his uncertainty. His biography of Lao Tzu is notably shorter and more tentative than his accounts of other philosophers. He records multiple versions of events. He acknowledges that the basic facts of the sage's life were already disputed in his own time. He even suggests, without fully committing to the idea, that the figure known as Lao Tzu might have been multiple people whose stories were combined into a single legend. Modern scholarship has only amplified these doubts. The name Lao Tzu simply means Old Master, a title rather than a personal name. No contemporary documents mention him by any name. The Tao Te Ching itself contains no biographical information about its author, no references to specific events or places that would anchor it in a particular time and life. Some scholars have argued that the text is an anthology, compiled over centuries, representing the wisdom of multiple Taoist sages rather than the insights of a single individual. Others have suggested that Lao Tzu was a purely mythological figure, invented to serve as the founder of a tradition that actually emerged more gradually and anonymously. Yet the specificity of certain details in the traditional accounts resists complete dismissal. The imperial archives at the Zhou court are historically attested. The hangar pass existed and served exactly the function the legend describes. the water buffalo, the gatekeeper, the number of characters in the text. These are odd particulars to invent for a purely mythological figure. They have the texture of memory rather than fabrication, the kind of irrelevant specificity that actual witnesses include in their accounts. Perhaps the most honest answer is that we cannot know. The figure of Lao Tzu exists at the edge of historical visibility, half illuminated by the fragmentary records of an age that kept few records. He may have been a single individual whose biography has been distorted by centuries of retelling. He may have been a composite, a name attached to a tradition to give it a human face. He may have been something stranger, a real person whose reality was so thoroughly absorbed into myth during his own lifetime that even his contemporaries could not separate the man from the legend. What we know with certainty is this: the Tao Te Ching exists. It has been translated into more languages than any book except the Bible. It has shaped the philosophy, religion, art, and politics of East Asia for over 2 millennia. Its influence extends far beyond the borders of China into the West, into modernity, into the conversations happening at this very moment in universities and meditation centers and online forums around the world. Whatever Lao Tzu was, man, myth, or something in between, his words remain. They have outlasted empires. They will outlast us. And yet the silence persists. The text speaks endlessly about what cannot be spoken. The tradition built on his teachings emphasizes emptiness, absence, the spaces between things rather than the things themselves. It seems almost fitting that the founder of such a tradition should have vanished so completely. He practiced what he preached. He returned to the formlessness from which he came. He became the silence he had described. There is a teaching in the Tao Te Ching that seems almost prophetic of its author's fate. The highest good is like water, it reads. Water benefits all things and does not compete. It flows in places that others reject and so is near to the way. Lao Tzu, if he existed, flowed west into the mountains like water seeking its level. He did not compete with the scholars who stayed behind, building reputations and accumulating disciples. He did not fight against the civilization he had decided to leave. He simply went. He found the place that others rejected, the wilderness, the silence, the absence, and he became near to the way. We stand now at the end of a journey that has carried us through the strange landscapes of ancient China. We have seen coffins suspended in midair, the secrets of their placement lost with the people who made them. We have seen pyramids hidden in plain sight, their contents locked away by a government that fears what excavation might reveal. We have seen a woman preserved for millennia by a process that modern science cannot replicate. Her body still soft and flexible when the rest of her world had long since turned to dust. We have seen monuments abandoned in mid-creation, testimony to the gap between imperial ambition and the laws of physics. And we have followed a philosopher into the mountains, watching him disappear into a silence that has never been broken. What thread connects these disparate mysteries? Perhaps it is this. In each case, we are confronted with the limits of our knowledge, with the uncomfortable truth that the past does not belong to us, that it holds secrets we cannot pry loose no matter how sophisticated our technology becomes. The Bo people knew how to suspend coffins on cliffs. They practiced this art for 3,000 years, passing the knowledge from generation to generation, perfecting techniques that modern engineers struggle to explain, and then, in a single campaign of extermination, that knowledge was erased from the world. No book preserved it. No survivor passed it on. It simply stopped existing. The coffins remain, but the understanding that created them is gone forever. The builders of the Xi'an pyramids knew what lay inside their structures. They knew the layout of the underground chambers, the nature of the treasures interred with the emperors, the traps and protections that guarded the burials. They knew, and they died, and their knowledge became state secrets that have been guarded for centuries. The Chinese government says that excavation cannot proceed until technology improves. Perhaps this is true. Perhaps there are genuine preservation concerns. Or perhaps there is something inside those tombs that someone does not want the world to see. The physicians who prepared Lady Di for her eternal rest knew the recipe for the fluid that would preserve her. They measured the proportions, mixed the compounds, sealed her away in layers of protection so effective that her body retained its elasticity for 21 centuries. And they never wrote the formula down. Or if they did, the document has been lost. Another technique that cannot be replicated. Another secret that the ancients took to their graves. The engineers at Yangshan knew, eventually, that their project was impossible. They knew that the stones could never be moved, that the monument could never be completed, that years of labour had been wasted on a demonstration of hubris. They knew the mathematics that modern analysts have since confirmed, and they kept silent. They left no account of how the decision was made to abandon the work. They protected the dynasty's honour at the cost of historical truth, and Lao Tzu, if he existed, knew something that he believed could be written in 5,000 characters but could never be truly understood. He knew the way, or claimed to know it, or approached it closely enough that his words have guided seekers for 25 centuries, and then he took that knowledge and rode west into the mountains and vanished from the world. In every case, we are left reaching for something that slips through our fingers. The past teases us with artifacts and texts and perfectly preserved bodies, but the meaning behind them remains elusive. We can measure the weight of the Yangshan stones, we can analyse the fluid around Lady Di's corpse, we can translate the Tao Te Ching into every language on earth, but we cannot resurrect the minds that created these things. We cannot ask them the questions we most want answered. We are separated from them by centuries and by death itself, left to speculate where we would rather know. Perhaps this is the deepest lesson that China's mysteries have to offer. That knowledge is fragile, that civilizations can rise to heights of achievement that seem impossible and then vanish, taking their secrets with them. That the progress we assume is permanent is actually contingent, dependent on the survival of traditions that can be broken by war, by censorship, by simple forgetfulness. The Bo people did not know they were the last generation. The engineers at Yangshan did not know their project would become a monument to failure. Lady Di's embalmers did not know that their technique would become one of the most studied and least understood procedures in archaeological history. Lao Tzu, if he rode west expecting his teachings to be forgotten, was wrong. But he could not have known that. He could not have predicted that his 5,000 characters would outlast everything else he touched. We who live in an age of digital preservation and global communication assume that knowledge, once recorded, will persist indefinitely. We store our documents in clouds, replicate our files across continents, build archives designed to survive catastrophes. We believe we have defeated forgetting. But China's mysteries suggest otherwise. They remind us that storage is not preservation. That understanding requires more than data. That the most sophisticated techniques can become incomprehensible within a few generations if the context that gave them meaning is destroyed. The coffins still hang on the cliffs. The pyramids still rise from the plains. The lady still sleeps in her museum case. The stones still lie in their quarry. The book still circulates in translation after translation. But the people who could explain them, the Bo mourners, the imperial architects, the Han physicians, the Ming engineers, the old master on his water buffalo are gone. They crossed thresholds we cannot follow. They entered silences we cannot break. We are left with questions. That is always how it ends. Not with answers, but with questions that multiply the more we learn. How did they do it? Why did they do it? What did they know that we have forgotten? What else has been lost that we do not even know to miss? These questions will outlive us, as they outlived the ancients. 1,000 years from now, others will stand before the hanging coffins and wonder. Others will examine the sealed pyramids and speculate. Others will read the Tao Te Ching and try to understand what the old master meant when he said that the name that can be named is not the eternal name. The mountains that swallowed Lao Tzu still stand in the west. The pass where he wrote his final words still channels travellers between worlds. The silence he sought still waits at the edges of civilization, patient and absolute, ready to receive anyone who chooses to ride toward it and disappear. Perhaps that is the way he described. Perhaps that is the truth he tried to capture in 5,000 characters and then abandoned in favour of the real thing. Perhaps all our words, all our monuments, all our elaborate preparations for immortality are just preludes to the silence that claims us all in the end. The water buffalo plods on, the mountain mist closes in, the gatekeeper watches until the figure becomes indistinct, becomes a shadow, becomes nothing at all, and the questions remain, hanging in the air like coffins on a cliff face, waiting for answers that may never come.